I should have started by saying this. The worst kind of betrayal isn't a punch or a shouted insult. It's when the people supposed to protect you tidy the truth away like dirty laundry and expect you to pretend you never noticed the stains. The night I found out my dad was cheating felt like the moment a house stops being a home and becomes a crime scene. Only there were no police, only the slow, meticulous way he stitched lies into polite conversation and smiled as if he hadn't pried the floorboards up under us for years. So here's how it went, and why every time I hear his name, my mouth tastes like ash. I still remember the sound the bedroom door made that night, the small, ordinary click that somehow unlatched everything. I wasn't supposed to be awake. I was 17, half-finished calculus homework, and a deadline for a college essay that felt like a ticket out. My mom was downstairs, washing dishes at midnight like she always did when she couldn't sleep, and my dad said he was working late. The house hummed with the thin comfort of routine. Then the noise, a message buzz from his phone where it shouldn't be, his laugh spilling into the dark hallway like a secret. I followed the sound because teenagers are invasive and fearless, because something inside me wanted to prove I wasn't imagining the way he'd been different for years. Colder, distracted, always disappearing for coffee that smelled like perfume. I caught him with a woman in our living room, and silence filled the space between their whispers. He froze like a man caught in a photograph, a wrong corner of family history forever exposed. There was no dramatic screaming scene, no melodramatic confrontation in the way movies would have you believe, just the horrible, slow rearrangement of reality. The woman slipping away, my dad smudging his face with both hands like a guilty boy, and me, a kid who had learned how to fold the corner of his life to hide the truth, standing in the doorway and feeling like I'd been made of glass and someone had just thrown a rock. After that, everything became loud. My mom's voice when she called him a liar, the way she packed boxes like she was packing away trust itself, the divorce papers, the lawyers, the endless replay of reasons and excuses. He didn't look like a villain in a film. He looked like a man who could still order family photos and RSVP to PTA meetings with comfortable charm. He looked like someone who could act like nothing had happened. And for a while, he managed to make a courtroom out of my family and win on technicalities. He denied it at first, of course. Denial is a man's favorite tool when he's been caught building his life on other people's money and patience. Then when the evidence was undeniable, he leaned into it like it was a right, as if his infidelity was a badge he'd earned and we were the ones who had failed to appreciate his ability to enjoy life. After my mom left, he would call and speak to me in a voice that was casual as a dinner invitation. He'd say, "You know how life goes. People meet, people connect." He'd show me pictures on his phone in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, photos of his arm around women I didn't know, snapshots of laughs that didn't belong in the storybook I grew up with. He brought them over sometimes. He introduced me to his lovers the way some fathers introduce their kids to a new tie, perfunctory, rehearsed, like a social obligation he checked off. He would watch my discomfort like a science experiment and then tell me I was dramatic for reacting. Why did I keep seeing him? Money and a rotten kind of duty. He had the kind of control that can be quiet as breathing, loans co-signed, the house still under his name, promises of college money dangling like a carrot I was too tired to refuse. There's a peculiar shame in being the one tied down by practicality while your parent lives like a monarch of disposable affection. I tell myself now it was survival instinct. I needed the support to finish school, to not become another statistic of kids who fall through the cracks. But at the time, it felt like living hand to hand with someone who had stolen your wallet and then sat across from you sipping the coffee you were someday supposed to afford. I told myself revenge was a childish thing. I told myself I should rise above the petty urge to humiliate him. But revenge isn't always about humiliation or violence. Sometimes it's about reclaiming dignity. Still, the bitterness grew like mold in the corners. small at first, then green and unstoppable. Every time he laughed about his free time in front of me, I felt something inside crack. The way he showed me photos, casual, careless, felt like salt in a wound. The women he dated, the nonchalance when he denied being involved with anyone else, the way he never once asked how we were, all of those things became threads in a rope I wanted to use to pull myself free. People ask what pushed me over the edge. It wasn't one thing. It was a slow build of disrespect, like the little things adding up into a verdict. The lie about paying the mortgage for months while he siphoned a second life, the arrogance with which he assumed my mom would quietly take the consequences, as if promises and vows were disposable. The way he looked at me when I refused to be complicit, with the same look men use when they underestimate a woman because she's young. There was a particular night that crystallized everything. He brought another woman to a family birthday, and she sat like she belonged, while my mother and I ate our cake with clenched knives behind our teeth. He didn't hide her. He took her arm the way he once took my mother's, like history can be overwritten with a new Instagram caption. That was the last straw, not because of a single act, but because it proved he felt no shame. I started to plan, and now I need to stop for a second and be honest. When I say plan, I don't mean I designed a crime. I wasn't going to ruin people with illegal acts or abandon my ethics to sink to his level. There are lines I refuse to cross, partly because I believe in consequences that don't involve becoming the person who hurt me, and partly because getting him back by breaking the law would only keep me tied to him in a different way, bound to courtrooms and prison cells instead of emotional blackmail. So the plan was more surgical, aimed at dismantling the soap opera of his love life the way one might strip wallpaper, patiently, carefully, without using a hammer to smash the wall itself. I'll admit, mine was equal parts strategy and emotional arson. I wanted to take away the one thing he liked more than anything, his narrative. He had created a version of himself in the world, generous, charming, the man who could have any woman he wanted, and he had monetized that image into affection and obedience. If I couldn't take back the money or exact legal retribution, I decided to attack the myth. My goal was reputation, influence, and his ability to be comfortable in the same room with people who depended on him for status. What would a man do when his curated life no longer held up under the weight of truth? That was the question that pushed me into action. First move, information. Not the illegal kind, not hacking phones or dragging private messages into public view, but compiling what hurt the most. Narratives, dates, photographs he'd shown in passing, things he had confessed in blithe moments. I made a ledger in my head and on paper, every small betrayal cataloged like evidence, every time he chose convenience over family. I turned grief into data. That sounds cold, but for me, it was survival. If emotions had been the fuel, facts would be the steering wheel. I started by confronting him in a way he couldn't ignore, with dignity. I wrote a long letter that read like an obituary for the father I thought I had. In it, I listed the ways his choices had hollowed our home and the invisible costs he'd piled onto our shoulders. I didn't accuse with the shrillness of rage. I used calm detail and quiet pain. I told him how his laughter at midnight and his casual photos had translated into a living pattern of abandonment. I asked him questions he couldn't answer without showing his true face. Would he explain to my mother why he had lied? Would he explain why he thought his lovers deserved the quiet dignity of normal life while she was left with the cleanup? I mailed that letter to him on a Monday morning and watched him try to pretend he hadn't received anything when he saw me the following weekend. He handled it like a man who'd been given an inconvenient bill. Next, I did something people don't usually think of as revenge. I built alliances. Not in the style of conspirators, but in the style of people who guard each other's dignity. There were women he had dated who had been burned too. They had their own stories, their own quiet shame. I reached out, but not to start a witch hunt. I listened. So many of them were tired of being trophies and wanted only to be treated like people. That changed everything. When you surround a predator with people who speak his truth, the predator loses the privacy he relies on. He becomes exposed, not because of a trap, but because he can no longer perform the illusion. People sometimes think the reveal has to be loud, an explosive scene at a wedding, an Instagram post with a million comments, a televised confession. I chose a different path. I began writing a series of anonymous essays, not to shame individuals for the sake of shaming, but to tell the story of what it feels like to be left behind by someone who used you as a backdrop. I wrote about the small daily humiliations, getting calls about bills he'd promised to pay, hearing his name at happy hours where women described their evenings with him like trophies, the way he asked for forgiveness and expected fast forgetfulness in return. These weren't exposés with names and faces. They were reflections on power and the cost of lies. They were relatable to anyone who had loved and been lied to. And people read them. They shared them. Here I must pause and ask you, be honest with me now, because this is where you get to sit in my seat for a second. If someone you loved had turned your life into a performance, would you have waited calmly, or would you have burned bridges to build a new path? What would you have done in my shoes? As the essays circulated, something subtle happened. The people who had known my dad only by reputation began to ask questions. A charity board member contacted me with curiosity about the tone of certain events. An old friend asked if it was true he had been very generous, but also very selective. Because I never named names, I never broke the law. I just inserted a narrative into the public conscience that didn't match his press release. Reputation is currency, and once the coin loses its luster, people stop spending it. Of course, he saw it as an attack. He started to act foolishly, trying to explain absent things, overcompensating with gifts, and finally, the worst of all, blaming me. He called me dramatic, unstable, a child acting out. That stung, because part of me had wanted to be the sober one, the adult who chose dignity over spectacle. But when he attacked me publicly, his mask slipped. His contradictions became more visible. He would make grand gestures, charity dinners where he over-emoted about family values, annual galas full of smiles and clinking glasses. But the whispering behind him told a different story. People began to notice. Does any predator ever think their camouflage will hold forever? No. It cracks at the edges when the right light hits it. I also did what parents should do for their kids. I protected my own future. Revenge that looked like sabotage would have left me worse off, so I focused on self-sufficiency, scholarships, part-time jobs, a plan to move out. If the ultimate goal was to strip him of the power he'd used to make us dependent, the healthier and smarter revenge was to cut that dependency. There is a kind of satisfaction in saying, I won't let you control my life because of money, and then acting on it. The irony was delicious. His ability to make me stay was always his greatest trophy, and I took that trophy and set it on fire, not with malice, but with the clean method of independence. People ask if I ever considered telling the women directly, sending a message with the bluntness I felt. Honestly, I did. I had 2 numbers, snippets of conversations, photographs he'd already shown me like confetti. Part of me wanted the immediate, sharp validation of confrontation. You deserve better, I wanted to write. Or, he's only with you because it's profitable. But I held back from that because revenge that seeks to humiliate another person, who might be as much a victim of charm and material comfort as my mother had been, would have degraded me. Not everyone who loves a cheater is aware. Some are as broken as we were. I refused to become a vessel for more hurt when what I needed was restoration. So, how did it finally unravel? It wasn't a single thunderclap moment. It was a slow erosion. The essays continued to land like small stones, and people began to connect dots they hadn't seen when his charisma shielded him. The charity board that had once hung on his every donation started to ask for transparent records. An ex-partner publicly posted a careful, tempered post about the cost of living with someone who loved attention more than honesty. My mother, who had rebuilt herself into someone I barely recognized at first, stronger, quieter, laughing again, refused to be erased by him. She took a stance that was not about vengeance, but dignity. She donated an old art piece he had always coveted to a community center with a note about the importance of integrity. Small gestures, not pyrotechnics, but they hit him where it hurt, in the elegant ecosystem of social approval he relied on. He tried to strike back. There were furtive calls, gestures, offers of reconciliation in exchange for silence. He tried to write us back into his story as the benevolent father. I refused. At a certain point, the sting of his behavior had been traded for the tranquility of a life I could own. He could post pictures, invite women into his life, but the narrative, the one the world began to accept, had shifted. No one liked a man whose private life contradicted his public virtue. People who once applauded him began to watch him with the wary attention one gives a man whose hands are always in someone else's pocket. The real climax came not as a dramatic exposure, but as the day he realized his social currency was gone. It wasn't that he was publicly humiliated on stage. Instead, invitations dried up, casual lunches were canceled, partnerships stalled. He called me one night, voice small, not the swaggering tone I was used to. He asked if we could talk. There was a tremor of something like regret in his voice. And for a moment, I felt that old, childish longing for reconciliation, but I had already rehearsed the answer: boundaries, dignity, and a refusal to be used. When I finally sat down with him, it was like meeting a stranger who remembered the shape of my face. I told him plainly that I wasn't interested in being bait for his guilt. I didn't need his apology to heal. I needed him to understand the cost of his choices and then leave. He reached for platitudes, but I pressed in on the specifics. The rent he promised and then delayed, the cheap condolence gifts in moments of real loss, the way he treated my mother as a placeholder. He tried to pivot to his own suffering, as if being human granted him a license. I didn't deny his humanity, I just refused the bargaining. People ask, did I feel satisfaction when it was all over? Yes and no. There was an undeniable sweetness in seeing a man so accustomed to levers of power find they no longer worked on me. There was also grief. Revenge had taken its toll. It had consumed nights, made me armor up in ways I didn't want to. There is a great cost to becoming the person who fights. You learn how to wound in ways that will forever change you. What surprised me was the quiet that came after. The world didn't explode into either punishment or absolution. It simply rearranged itself. My mother and I began to laugh in ways that weren't hollow. I moved into a small apartment with a crooked balcony we could barely afford and a thrift store couch that ate homework and hosted new friends. He continued with his life, but the mirror had been altered. The reflection was less flattering, and apparently that alone was devastating for him. The revenge I achieved was not about ruin, but about reclaiming space. I had taken the things that he used to keep me tethered and returned them to myself. I want to say this clearly. Revenge isn't the clean triumph movies make it out to be. It is messy and often leaves collateral damage. But sometimes when you've been minimized for years, the only way to feel human again is to remove yourself from the orbit of the person who made you small. I didn't bring him down with secrets or crimes. I brought him down by taking my life seriously and refusing to be part of his narrative. I withdrew my energy, built a story that aligned with my dignity, and let the rest fall where it would. There were moments I worried I'd become the very thing I despised: cold, calculating, detached. But even as I planned and strategized, I kept one rule: no physical harm. No public shaming that relied on humiliation of people he loved who may have been as complicit through ignorance as he was through choice. I wanted justice, not revenge that would poison me. So many revenge stories end with a person hollowed out because they sacrificed their own soul for the satisfaction of watching another fall. I didn't want that. So, if you're sitting there thinking, Well, that sounds like a long and complicated way to get even. I get it. There are days when I'd tell a different story, when the urge to send a text that would ruin him forever was almost unbearable. But then I remember that some satisfactions are not worth the lifetime. So what would you have done? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? Would you have set your life on fire to watch his smoke? Or would you have built something so sturdy that his gusts couldn't knock it down? I chose the latter. It took time, it took patience, and sometimes it felt painfully slow. But the payoff was more than humiliation. It was reclamation. Sometimes, late at night, I think of him and feel neither hatred nor pity, just the strange relief that comes when a story ends and you are left to write your own epilogue. We are both still alive. He is still doing whatever men of his type do, charming, collecting, moving on, and I am here, with my crooked balcony and my thrift store couch, with a job that doesn't make me feel invisible, and a set of friends who call me when I haven't answered their texts. That for me is revenge enough.